Well, then I think it's time to get started here. Before we do, I want to show off today's tie. That is not precisely the layout. It's a rearranged layout of the control panel of the Apollo command module. Because, of course, today we are celebrating the 56th anniversary of the landing of Apollo 11 on the moon. So I don't have a talk prepared that ties into that theme because I didn't think that far ahead, but all happy, I hope, to celebrate the fact that we've been there and wonder when we're going back.
That
So
is a very cool tie. I love it.
this is a tie from Cyber Optics Tie Lab, my favorite tie place. They're a Detroit artisan tie shop that does a lot of geeky ties, mostly based on public domain art. NASA imagery, if it doesn't have the NASA logo or a recognizable person, is generally public domains. They use a lot of NASA imagery. They use 1900 era Gray's Anatomy for their anatomy stuff because anatomy good enough for a tie hasn't really changed in 120 years. All sorts of places that they get cool, geeky art for relatively low cost and turn it into really classy ties. So Bex is joining us. So if you're into ties, which I have become kind of my brand, my branding, I highly recommend Cyber Optics Tie Lab. But we're not here to talk about ties today. We are here to talk about today's presentation. I need to share the screen. Need to remember to click the button to optimize the video and share. Participants can now see your screen. Yes, I know. That's why I'm here. So today we are going to talk about what I call mosaic fiction, and we'll talk about that label a little bit on one of the early slides. Nonlinear fiction that adds up to a bigger story. Titled How I Met Your Story after what I consider to be the absolute most powerful example of mosaic fiction out there, the show How I Met Your Mother. If you haven't seen it, you can still enjoy this presentation, I hope. If you have seen it, you'll recognize some of the things I'm talking about. But if you haven't seen it, I'm going to spoiler the hell out of it. So just so you're warned in advance, I'm not keeping any secrets because I have lessons to make, points to make here. So I almost rewatched for this presentation, except that right now I can't find my DVDs, so I'm going to have to chase those down.
Big party for an American hero. My son, the astronaut.
But could you pay me in advance?
Are you serious?
So there's our video clip for Paying for the Soup. I liked it because A, I love his laughing and his acting, and B, it ties into today's astronaut theme. So we're going to be talking about Paying for the Soup, and so that I don't have to keep explaining why I included the quote from Edith Keeler for this. Most of you have been here for this before, so you understand the idea that I am happily presenting these classes for free, but I'm kind of hoping you like it enough that you go out and buy some of my books. Today we are looking at two particular books. Generally, the one on the right I have every week, Making Story Models. It is my book for writers on techniques for visualizing your story, visualizing your plot, visualizing the connections between characters, visualizing all the elements of your story. And it is the culmination of a lot of thought and hard work that I put in thinking about story modeling based on the time and effort I put in on software modeling because there's actually a lot of similarities there. It was originally done as presentations for FireCon. Hi, Jenna. Jenna and Don Ray are the organizers of FireCon, my favorite conference out there for writers and artists. And I presented some of this Making Story Models content there. I also presented it for Dave Farland, or Dave Wolverton for his formal name, for his Apex Writers Group, which is a group of writers gathering every week to talk about topics related to the business, to the craft, and so on. I presented this for Dave's class when Dave was still around because it was material inspired by lectures from him, but it was also, some of it was inspired by my saying, but that doesn't make sense. And he said, well, that's just the way it's always been done. And after I presented this material, he came back and said, you're right. Now I see what you were talking about. So the QR code on the right will take you for that. On the left is my fiction offering for this week. Uncle Roy's Computer Repairs and Used Robot Parts is a novella that I wrote and sold to Analog, and they published it going back over a year ago now. And then later on, early this year, the Analog readership selected it for their Analytical Laboratory Award as the best novella of 2024. When people said, that's cool, where can I read it? I said, well, used copies of Analog are selling for $20 right now on Amazon. Maybe you don't want to read it that much. And then I said, but maybe. And I put together a collection of that story plus 24 other stories. Okay, full disclosure, 22 other stories and 2 poems. I have committed poetry. But for the same price as that used copy of Analog, $20, you can get, actually for less than that, you can get this collection of 25 of my works. Some of them have been already published in the past in Analog or in Baen anthologies. Some of them are brand new. All for, I believe it's $16.99, but you can't quite get it yet. The QR code there at the bottom is for a pre-order link for the ebook, which will release on the 31st of this month. The book will also be available on the 31st, but they don't let me do pre-orders. But the page for the print book will go live then. So Uncle Roy's Computer Repairs and Used Robot Parts and Other Stories. The longest title I expect I will ever create. Those of you who've been around a while understand my motto of tools, not rules. We're going to be talking about some tools you might use in your fiction. They are not and never will be rules. I am very adamant about this. Anyone who gives you a rule for writing other than you must write is either naive or they're trying to sell you something. Everything beyond you must write is a rule that might be really helpful, except when it's not. It might be something that this helped me, but it might not help you. It's good to know these tools, but to blindly follow them as rules is never going to be guaranteed to do anything. It's a good practice. It might be good for a particular story, but it's not a rule because a rule always works. And as William Goldman, the gentleman behind The Princess Bride, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and a whole lot of other screenplays and books, told us, nobody knows anything. He was talking about that in the context of Hollywood screenwriting, but it applies to all creative arts. Not one person in the motion picture field knows what's going to work. They only know things that have worked and are worth trying. But until you put it to an audience, you really don't know. So the idea that there's rules out there is misleading, but really tempting. It's really easy to forget, especially me. I tend to be a little bit bombastic in my presentations when I want to hammer home a point. So I may call something a rule. It's not a rule. It's still a tool. So never let anybody tell you the rules of writing. Just nod politely and let them go. Okay. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I am going to spoil the hell out of How I Met Your Mother because I have particular lessons to teach and I cannot possibly hold back on details without and still teach those lessons, including if you haven't watched it yet, I am going to spoil the biggest spoiler of the entire series because it will be necessary at some point to understand some of the other lessons. Probably. It depends. The last time I taught this, which was at FireCon, yes, I had to spoil that ending to make my points. I still love the show, knowing all the spoilers that are coming up. I still love it just for the absolute genius storytelling of it. Uh, Bays and Thompson, the creators of this, the writers of this, I wish I could spend a weekend talking writing with them because there's so much, absolute, so much glorious storytelling wisdom in how the show is put together. I'm going to try to present a little bit of that to you here. But apologies for the spoilers. A lot of what I will be talking about here is narrative techniques, and it will come from this particular Wikipedia article, which I consider to be a great article that you want to follow. Wikipedia list of narrative techniques. As it explains, strategy for making a narrative to relay information to develop the narrative, usually in order to make it more complete, complex, or interesting. These are techniques, these are tools, these are not rules. But what I love particularly about this Wikipedia page is it has 64 specific techniques studied in lit classes, categorized into broader areas. And those are wonderful guides to thinking about story structure. Thinking, tools, not rules, not mandatory, optional. One of which is the frame story. And I had no idea until I started really studying how I was writing. I had no idea how much I love frame stories and other non-linear narratives. I never knew it. I never analyzed my own preferences, but I start finding that many of my favorite things are non-linear and specifically framing stories. So a frame story is a device for a convenient conceit to tell other stories. Sometimes, historically, there are other stories that were pulled from older cultural traditions and organized together to make essentially a themed collection, a themed anthology, just to tell a longer story. And two classic examples in English, although one is translated into English, are A Thousand and One Nights and the Canterbury Tales. There are also uh, other examples in other cultures, which I unfortunately do not speak the languages, but I'm told that China has some frame stories. India has some massive frame stories. I'm not trained to read those, but the concept is very similar. If you haven't run into these, 1001 Nights is a story about a woman, Scheherazade, who has been captured by the Sultan, captured and wed involuntarily, very involuntarily, because she knows this sultan has a long tradition. He weds you, beds you, and slays you in the span of days. And it's guaranteed, it has never not happened. So she is the next who is going to be slain. But she has a plan. Her plan is she's going to tell him a story tonight. And she's not going to finish it. If he wants to hear the end of the story, he has to wait till tomorrow night, which means she has to live through that night. At the end of that second day, she finishes that story and starts a second. At the end of the next day, she finishes that story and starts a third, and so on. And this is how she goes through the 1001 Nights. And by the end of it, he has actually fallen in love with her and isn't going to kill her. That is the conceit. What actually it is a collection. It's not 1001. It is hundreds, but it's not really 1001. If you look at different sources, it can be anywhere from a couple hundred to 500 some traditional stories from the Arabic culture that have been gathered into this. So the book is an excuse to tell all these stories and organize them. So It is really a whole bunch of stories from that culture all gathered into one place. The Canterbury Tales isn't quite as many, but the concept is similar. Nobody's going to die every night on this one, but the concept of the Canterbury Tales is there's one place in the medieval history of Europe at that time where the different classes cross. You're all supposed to do a religious pilgrimage at some point, and everybody heads off. I don't remember where their pilgrimages were to. It's the similar to the Arabic pilgrimage to Mecca, but I'm not sure where their pilgrimage was to because I haven't read it in a long time. But on the pilgrimage, everyone is kind of equal. You have lords by peasants, by soldiers, by scholars. Everyone is drawn together in an era where we walk everywhere, so it's going to be a long trip. We don't have any TV to entertain us. We don't have much of anything other than stories. So different nights, different people tell their stories. And the Canterbury Tales is therefore a collection of stories told across the classes from the culture. So it's another gathering place of different stories that might not have been together in other circumstances, but they're all drawn together here. Two related literary techniques. One is the framing device, which is kind of essentially the same thing on a smaller scale. It is one frame around one story. The frame story is a bigger frame around multiple stories. Also, story within a story. So if a frame is a story around other stories, the story within the story is one of those inner stories. And I said story an awful lot in that paragraph, but that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. You don't necessarily have to be in a frame story to have story within a story. Sometimes it's just natural that a story that you're telling has a reference to some other narrative, and so you tell that other narrative and then come back. Notice something particular about the two examples I used. The 1001 Nights, not a single one of those hundreds or thousands stories involved Scheherazade and the Sultan. Most of them didn't involve any common characters at all. Some of them did, stories of traditional folk heroes that showed up in more than one story, but most of them didn't. The Canterbury Tales, there was no real crossover. Yes, the tale teller that night was sometimes a character in the tale they told, but you really had no tight connection between these pieces. It was, and certainly no tight connection to the frame story. I think that tight connection makes what I call a frame story. And a clip.
And that was when I realized why I hung out with Barney. I never got where I thought I wanted to go, but I always got a great story.
So, that girl you were talking to, that was Mom?
Kids, every story in a man's life is like a dot in an impressionist painting. And when
So that's a no?
Yeah, that's a no. What? Come on.
If you are not familiar with How I Met Your Mother, a show which ended 11 years ago now, so you could be forgiven to never having run across it. The premise of the show is Ted Mosby at some future point in the far distant future of 2024. That tells you how old this show was. Sits down to tell his two kids the story of how he met their mother. And he is going to tell this story in his own non-biased, non-linear fashion. He's telling episodes from his past. And the lines there, I thought in that clip, which was from a very early first season episode, in hindsight, he told the whole story of the show in that little clip. So first, how when he went out with Barney, who is one of the prime characters, he never knew what the story was going to be, but he knew he was going to have a great ride. And the other is when the kids say, "So that was mom?" And he's like, every story in a man's life is like a dot in a, I don't remember which term he used, but it's really, he's talking about a pointillist painting. It is a dot that adds up to the man's life. That is the story of the show, summarized right there. That every one of these episodes adds up to this bigger picture. I call this technique a mosaic story, where the story is told in terms of other stories that collectively tell the big story. Now, I call it a mosaic story. You need to be aware that other people are going to use that term slightly differently. What they call mosaic fiction or mosaic novel is almost the same concept. It's a story made up of other stories all in a common universe, but they don't necessarily require that it add up to one big story. One of the earliest uses of mosaic story in this sense was the Wild Cards series, edited by George R. R. Martin, which was essentially a superhero world for a shared universe that a bunch of science fiction and fantasy writers of the day wrote stories about their superheroes within this larger universe. I thought Wild Cards was good. Eventually, I got tired of it because it just was going on, and I didn't see a point. I didn't see that larger story, but I enjoyed the individual stories. But it did not add up to the larger piece. It did not add up to something extra. So I prefer to reserve Mosaic Story for all these small pieces add up to one big thing, but they're revealed out of order. Sometimes you're even going to see them get corrected, or you're going to see the same story from a different point of view. But when you put the last story in place, you see the big picture. And specifically, to answer the question of what is a mosaic story, I'm going to give you 3 examples here, one of which is absolutely self-interested, and I don't care because it was my point. So Citizen Kane, if you haven't watched it, why are you watching me when you could be watching Citizen Kane? Is the story of Charles Foster Kane, a big media magnate who dies, and after his death, the public, particularly the journalists, want to understand the man's life. So they go back and interview people from his past. And these interviews, out of order, sometimes repeating the same territory from another point of view, all of these interviews add up to the picture of the man. Now, I think it is a wondrous film. I will watch it on any excuse. I may have to watch it again tonight now that I've talked about it. It has one weakness, in my opinion, which is the frame story itself. The journalist trying to understand the man is an extremely thin story on its own. The flashbacks that add up to who is Charles Foster Kane are a wonderful story. The journalist doing the investigation is strictly an excuse for the flashbacks. But I love it. When I wrote my novel, The Last Dance, the origin of this is a little nonlinear in its own way. I wrote a novella, which eventually was published in Analog, called Murder on the Aldrin Express. It was a mystery story set aboard a Mars Cycler, a ship that orbits to Mars and back to Earth on a regular, predictable pattern, long trips. But on the trip back from Mars to Earth, we discover that there was confusion about the death of a major character. And we have an investigation going back and telling the events leading up to his death from the point of view of different characters. Notice how, without any planning, just the way my mind went, I am telling a frame story in Murder on the Aldrin Express. But I'm also really kind of in a mosaic story because the murder mystery itself is a meaty frame story. I didn't realize how much I liked that, but intrinsically, I'm already doing it. That story was, no modesty here, extremely successful. It was eventually named a year's best science fiction story from Gardner Dozois and ended up in his Year's Best Volume 31. It was also named a Year's Best Short Novel by Alan Castor's, what's his name? Audiovox, is that? I forget the name of his company, but they did an annual collection of short science fiction stories, and it was a Year's Best in there. And it was hugely popular with fans, including some fans who were big friends of mine who said, "We're not done with this character of Nick Ames. We want to know more about Nick Ames. You'd better be writing a Nick Ames story, or we're going to have to come after you." So I said, well, yeah, there's potential in that character, Nick Ames and his second in command, Lieutenant Carver. There's potential in there. And I said, I kind of see some things. So I went and told a story, which was the story of Carver's wedding, because the end of Murder on the Aldern Express was him reconciling with his former fiancee. So I'm going to tell the story of their wedding aboard the ship, and I get maybe 10% in the story, and it starts becoming the story, a giant flashback to the day of Nick's wedding that eventually fell through. But it's the story of how Nick met Rosalia and fell in love, and their clashes over professional issues because they're both astronauts in a very high stress position, and how their wedding falls apart eventually, and how neither one of them have fully healed from this sense decade plus later. And so I said, okay, that's a good story. And then I said, okay, now people are asking for even more. So I sat down and I had a vision that the next title would be Mutiny on the Aldern Express. And I sat down to start telling the mutiny story. And I'm less than a chapter in, and the investigator of this mutiny, Inspector General Park Urim, she is talking to the ship's doctor, who is one of many, many, many in the crew who are extremely hostile that their captain is being investigated. And she's like, look, I don't understand why you're protecting this man. Everyone knows how difficult he is, how demanding he is. And I need you to explain this to me. And all of a sudden, the doctor starts telling her story, because I am a pantser, a discovery writer. I didn't know this was coming. The doctor starts telling the story of her first mission with Nick Ames. And suddenly I realized I'm telling a Mosaic story. I didn't have the term then. I said I was telling a frame story. But I realized that I am telling a frame story. And this is a whole lot bigger than a novelette or a novella. This is a novel. And I start seeing a structure, which is the odd numbered chapters are Park Urim investigating the charges. The even numbered chapters are crew members telling of their first experience with Nick Ames. And back and forth, odd, even, odd, even. Eventually, the two stories that I'd already written become chapters in that even side, the flashback stories. And eventually, I am telling a story where these two narrative structures, the past flashbacks and the present investigation, intersect in the present with another flashback, where we see the flashback to how Park Urim got this assignment and was the only one who could possibly catch the ship in time to go investigate, and how she's caught in the middle. This was, by this point, it was no longer exactly discovery writing because I had a structure in mind, the odd-even structure. But I didn't know what either the odds or the evens would be just looking at what came before. But it was partly my conscious decision and my conceit that I wanted to do Citizen Kane in Space only better, because I wanted my frame story to be a frame story, an actual story. And I think I succeeded at this. This particular book was the #1 ebook science fiction on Amazon for the entire month of October 2019. It is currently, I believe, 16,000 copies sold and has got an average review of about 4.4. I think I accomplished my goals. And my goals, I didn't have a name for it at the time, but my goals were to make a Mosaic story. And then the ultimate Mosaic story, in my opinion, is How I Met Your Mother over here on the right. And we're going to be teaching Mosaic story using that as our examples. So we're going to look first at elements of a Mosaic story, things that collectively add up to the larger story. First is the unifying conceit. Notice every one of these techniques I'm talking about are from that Narrative Techniques website. Unifying conceit is the reason why we're telling all these stories. And the reader knowing up front, we're going to be telling you stories, setting things up so that you understand why this structure is nonlinear. I do have to tell you, a nonlinear story really annoys some readers. I have got, again, an average of 4.4 review on this book, but I've got a lot of one reviews of people who hate the fact that they're reading out of order. You just can't succeed with this in pleasing everybody. I first tried to sell this book to Baen Books, and Baen Books, love them dearly. I've sold a novel to them, and I've sold many short stories to them. Baen Books looked at this and said, this is a short story collection. It's not a novel. It's a short story collection. Readers hate short story collections, and they have the sales numbers to know that novels outsell short story collections 10 to 1. And they're like, we don't want a short story collection. We want a novel. My editor at 47 North, who ultimately published the book, loved the fact that it was nonlinear. So just know that when you're doing a nonlinear story, some people are going to hate it just because it's nonlinear. But the unifying conceit is letting them know up front that you are going to be telling a story of stories and why we're reading out of order. And this is a story why, not a structure why. The structure why is because it's a cool thing to do. Honestly, I had fun with it. Or even just because you like it. But you need a reason why. In the case of The Last Dance, it was investigating the purported crimes of Captain Nick Ames. In How I Met Your Mother, it is the reason why. The reason is the father telling the children how he met their mother. So this kind of carries the spine of the larger story. This is the reason why we are here for the larger story. You do have to decide how detailed it's going to be. Again, in Citizen Kane, it was thin. It, on the other hand, in The Last Dance and in How I Met Your Mother, it is somewhat thicker. How I Met Your Mother, honestly, it is, I don't know, it's kind of as thin as Citizen Kane, but we don't really care because we're caught up in the episodes. And you may include the knowledge that this is a mosaic. In the case of How I Met Your Mother, he told us right there in that clip from an early episode that these are going to add up to something bigger. So in the case of How I Met Your Mother, the entire story, the entire series is the unifying conceit. I'm going to tell you How I Met Your Mother, but I'm not going to do it in a simple A to B to C to D order. Then you have your episodes, which are things that happened in the past, or it might be the future, or even history, but they're adding to the mosaic. And sometimes you'll have multiple episodes even within one story. Sometimes it advances the unifying conceit. So sometimes, in the case of Last Dance, they kind of all did, that they added to the picture. But sometimes in How I Met Your Mother, the stories are mostly for entertainment value. They aren't answering the How I Met Your Mother question. They're answering what was my life before I met your mother. Sometimes they'll show another perspective. There is an episode in How I Met Your Mother called, I think, just called How I Met Your Father, which is also the name of a sequel series, which just does not compare. Sorry, it doesn't. But in the How I Met Your Father episode, we see the mother's life leading up to their meeting. And so that's a whole different perspective on the same concept. Sometimes an episode just sets a mood. The episodes generally don't know they're part of a mosaic. We are telling stories from his life. He did not know. Okay, he had a faith. The big defining element of Ted Mosby was he knew the one was out there for him, and they were going to have the house in the suburbs and the 2 kids, and so he kind of had a knowledge of that's what his life is going to be, damn it. But he didn't know he was telling, he was living the elements of that pointless picture that would add up to his life. And How I Met Your Mother, of course, every single week is an episode, but also we have episodes within episodes. And we're going to be talking about an episode called Lucky Penny, which has episodes within episodes. Unifying symbols are a really powerful technique in a Mosaic story because when the symbols recur, because they might not be obvious the first time, but when the symbols recur, all of a sudden the audience starts having this picture of, ah, there is that symbol. That might be important to the larger story. So therefore, if I see that symbol, it matters. Now, this is one of the drawbacks of How I Met Your Mother early on. I watched a couple of episodes because my niece and nephew loved it, but I wasn't in on the whole story and the whole unifying conceit, so I didn't understand what I was seeing. So sometimes they aren't symbols that mean anything because I haven't seen them before. But over time, on rewatching the whole series, I start to see, aha, that symbol means we are discussing this element of the larger story. So sometimes the unifying conceit in the example of How I Met Your Mother, because he knows the end point of the whole thing, he actually points out the symbols when they appear so that the reader is kind of, or the viewer is kind of getting a reminder of, hey, yes, don't forget why this is important. And some of the biggest symbols in How I Met Your Mother, the two biggest ones are the blue French horn and the yellow umbrella. The blue French horn was when Ted goes on his first date with the first woman we see him meet, and there's a blue French horn hanging in the restaurant, and to impress Robin, he steals it and gives it to her. And eventually, all sorts of stories relate to that, including having to give the blue French horn back because the restaurant remembers who he was and comes after him. But the blue French horn becomes a symbol for the relationship he doesn't have with Robin because in that early first episode, he blows it. He does all sorts of things wrong. She becomes a good, trustworthy, reliable friend within his friend group. But the relationship got missed because of some of his mistakes. But the blue French horn was not a mistake. She found this a touching, romantic gesture, stealing the blue French horn. So that blue French horn is a symbol of the relationship and the loss. Meanwhile, the yellow umbrella comes in a little later and gets talked about a lot before it really starts becoming significant. There was a party that he went to on a night where he was having a really bad day and things were just not working out well for him. And he eventually left his cell phone, I think it was, at the party. So he comes back the next day to get it. And there's all sorts of stuff in the lost and found because this was an epic party where lots of things happened. And while he's there, it starts to rain outside, and he sees a yellow umbrella in the lost and found, which isn't his, but he just takes it because it's raining out there. Later on, we learn, and he tells us this as the voiceover in the episode, that was the mother's yellow umbrella, which she left there because she was at the same party. And this is one of many places where they didn't meet but might have, but they weren't ready to meet. And so the yellow umbrella becomes a recurring symbol of Ted's quest for the one. And it becomes a symbol for his desires, his needs. And one other unifying symbol is legend. Wait for it. Theory. And that's pretty much an exact quote from Barney in multiple cases, where he is drawing your attention to something he thinks you're going to remember for a long time. And very often, it is something you will remember, maybe not for the reasons he thought. There are other unifying symbols, but those are the three that I think cut across the series most. And now you have these stories, which, again, are adding up to a structure, but it's being told out of order. So that structure is kind of just appearing on its own, and you have to. And this is the risk with a Mosaic story. You have to trust that the readers will trust. You have to trust that the story is coming out of these pieces. So you can have a structure, you can have a traditional story structure, but you're telling it out of order. And as these pieces start to come in, as all of these elements are brought in place, all of these episodes, they add up to the structure. But they weren't necessarily revealed in the order of the structure. All of the try-fails, the challenges, the tension, the successes, and the dooms, they all are there out of order. Now, another narrative technique that is very much part of Mosaic stories is the flashback. You alter the time sequence, you go back to some other earlier event and tell that. And so often, especially in a Mosaic story, an episode is in the past the unifying conceit. So it may be a flashback by itself. It may also be flashbacks from another episode. So these fill in the past of the Mosaic. And in the case of this particular series, the whole series is one giant 9 seasons of flashbacks. That the series itself is Ted in the future of 2024 telling flashbacks to his kids. So the series is by definition flashbacks, but we also see flashbacks of other places within the stories. So we often see flashbacks back to Ted and Marshall's days in college at Wesleyan University that show how the two of them met and how they met Lily, who was fated to be Marshall's wife and vice versa, practically from the moment they set eyes on each other. But the flashbacks to Wesleyan College are often showing how we got to where we are today. And then in the case of Robin, who is the woman who did not become Ted's girlfriend and the mother early on, Robin eventually we discover has her whole Canadian past, which is a source of much amusement to the characters who mock Canada because they're all sophisticated New Yorkers who are far better than others, even though in fact the only one who's really a New Yorker is Barney. But they all mock her for her Canadian past, but particularly they mock her because eventually in one episode it's discovered that she used to be a Canadian teen pop star, Robin Sparkles. And so we see multiple flashbacks from the Robin Sparkles days, which are dead-on satires of 80s music culture, 80s teen music culture in particularly. And so we see flashbacks of that. We see flashbacks that happen sometimes where, well, this episode's really picking up on what happened last week or happened weeks ago or months ago or seasons ago. So we sometimes have flashbacks just to recap what came before. And then we have a couple of episodes that are very specifically about flashbacks. And I want to talk about those two as good examples. There is an episode called Trilogy Time, where the 3 guys in the group, Barney and Marshall and Ted, are getting together for their recurring rewatch of the entire Star Wars trilogy, back when there was only one trilogy. That was, to them, it was the entirety of Star Wars. And they every so often get together and watch this. It is a bonding experience for them that has been going on essentially ever since they met Barney. It's been going on. But in this episode, we go back to those earlier watches to see how, yes, they're watching the trilogy and events are happening in their lives and they're struggling. And part of what you also see is deceptive flash forwards to, well, but the next time we watch this, this is what my life will be like. And they are wild flights of fantasy, nothing that could ever really happen, but some of it is plausible. And then we see the next flashback where, nope, none of that has happened. He's got new struggles, or Marshall has new struggles, or Barney has new struggles. We see the new struggles, but the next time we watch, this is going to happen. And they see the next one, and no, that hasn't happened. But you're seeing this pattern of life is miserable, so we're going to watch this movie because it gives us comfort, and things will be better next time. So that is the flashback structure in Trilogy Time. Lucky Penny also has a very distinct flashback structure. It opens with Ted and Robin running through the airport. He has to make a flight to Chicago to interview for a job, and they're running through this, and they mention why they're running, why they're late. And we jump back to a flashback of why they're late. And as that is going on, there is a mention of how we got into this situation, this dilemma, and that becomes a flashback. And how we got into this dilemma, and that becomes a flashback. And eventually, telling in reverse order, we understand how they got to the running through the airport situation. From all of these simple decisions, they're trying to blame who's responsible for us being late. And ultimately, it comes back to Ted having found a penny in the subway. And Ted is a geek. I love Ted, but Ted is a geek. And Ted is into coin collecting. And this was a really amazing old penny. And everything else that happened from there, every flashback, every complication and disaster was because Ted found that penny and was going to make use of that penny to change the world. And in the end, he sold the penny for enough to buy a hot dog for him and for Robin. So the lucky penny wasn't that lucky. There was an example of a story told entirely in flashbacks, much like the series as a whole. We can also see flash forwards. So we temporarily jump forward in time to look at what's coming as a consequence of what we're seeing. So sometimes one episode may be in the future of the frame story. It may be a flash forward for the conceit. It might be just a flash forward for another episode. Sometimes it's not a true flash forward. Looking at the lucky penny, the flash forwards in the flashbacks, none of them ever really happened. But they were flash forwards what we thought would happen, but they can also reveal the actual future. This has nothing to do with the book Flash Forward by my friend Rob Sawyer, which is a wonderful book that became a TV series that, well, network TV being what it was, never quite took off like he hoped it would. But no, this is not Rob's Flash Forward. This is the literary technique of Flash Forward. And there are many flash forwards. Here are a few examples in How I Met Your Mother. One is the frame itself. If you think about the story as being the episodes you watch every week, as opposed to Ted talking to his kids, then from that point of view, the entire frame is flash forwards. The entire frame is revealing details about the Ted we're watching from week to week. It is telling us, hey, this is where these stories ultimately lead. So the frame itself could be considered a flash forward. But one very specific flash forward is the wedding that happens in season 9. Season 9 is events that happen entirely within 2 days of the weekend of a wedding. But in season 8 and even season 7, I'm not sure, it might go back to season 6, we occasionally get brief flash forwards to scenes from that wedding. We see, oh, this wedding is happening, and wait a minute, the groom is Barney? Because the first time we see the flash forward to the wedding, everybody is going to assume that this is Ted's wedding in the future. And the next flash forward, it's Barney. And Barney is a character. Barney is a very pathetic man. He's funny as hell. A lot of the humor comes out of Barney, but ultimately Barney is a broken man. And we get flashbacks into his past and see how he was raised in a home with a mother who was let's call her a free spirit. She was roadies for half the bands in the 70s and 80s, I swear. He has no real concept of how to make meaningful emotional connections. So instead, he's all about how many women can he bet. He keeps score. He keeps diaries of this. He plans campaigns to track down the next woman. And he's famous for essentially one and done. After he's had you, he doesn't want to see you. So the idea that this wedding is Barney's wedding, that is astonishing. And now it's created tension because the viewer wants to understand, why is Barney getting married? And then there's another flash forward coming up, and we'll talk about this one, where we see the groom is and not or see who the bride is, and now it's like, oh my word, how did this happen? Another one, which is a flash forward, which is very, very emotional and touching if you've seen the last episode, but this is before the last episode. But you can infer from the mood. There is an episode called Vesuvius in the 9th season after we have finally met who the mother was, because we didn't get to see her for a long time. There is this episode where it happens in the future, and Ted and Tracy, the mother, are back at the inn where they met originally at Barney's wedding, where she was in the band. And they are having a celebration of their meeting and of their marriage and how things have gone for them. This is a giant flash forward, which starts to set the tone, if you're paying attention, that things aren't right. That Ted is really sad about something. And eventually, and I told you I was going to spoil the ending. In the final episode, we learn that at the time where he's talking to the kids, she's been dead for years. So this whole lead up to finding the one was perfect. But in real life, nothing's forever. And so this episode, Vesuvius, is they know her diagnosis. They're having this get together in the vacation place where they met because they're trying to squeeze as much in to the time left as they possibly can. But you don't know that at the time. If you've been paying really close attention, you may suspect this, but you don't know it at the time. There are critics of the show, because I happen to think it's nearly perfect. I love it. There are critics of the show who felt like her death at the end was a cop-out. It came from nowhere. They didn't know how to end it, so they just did this. Vesuvius shows, no, they knew. But there are other episodes that show that they knew this. This was the plan all along. And in fact, there is an entire meta narrative, a fact that shows they knew. Because one problem with a series that's going to run 9 seasons, they didn't know it would be 9. They hoped for 8. They got 9 as a surprise, but they knew it might be cut off at any time. Network TV, that happens. But one problem with something that you're planning to go 8 series and your character is talking to his teenage kids who are 16 and 15 years old is by the time that final episode is going to air, they're going to be in their mid-20s. They ain't going to look like kids. So in fact, the producers and directors on a closed set shot scenes with the kids in season 1 and 2. So those scenes could be shot at the age when they were supposedly being told the story. There is a hilarious parody video out there, which is made by the 2 actors who played the kids when they're in their 20s. And they're complaining about how he sat them down and told them this story for 9 years, never let them leave the house. They can't even use the bathroom. But literally, they filmed the ending late in season 1 or early in season 2. So they knew how this was ending. And Vesuvius was written and directed in that time frame. But back to the subject of flash forwards. Remember I mentioned trilogy time as an example of flashbacks. It is also an example of flash forward. Because after we've seen all the flashbacks, Marshall and Ted and Barney are setting in today in story time to watch the trilogy. And now we get another flash, but this one is a flash forward. And at the time they're watching, Ted is once again between women. Once again, his life has not turned out how he expected. Things are just awful. In the flash forward, Barney and Marshall are grumbling to each other because Ted is going to bring her to the viewing. And that's never part of the equation. It's always just the guys. It's bringing her. And so the viewer watching this thinks, Ted finally met the mother, and we're going to meet her in this episode because he's going to bring her. And Ted comes in the door. Yes, I get emotional about this series. I think it works on so many levels. He comes in the door carrying his daughter and how in love he is with her. So we get flash forward at the end of that episode. Sorry. All right. We can also have foreshadowing, which is not as explicit as a flash forward. It's more subtle. It might not be a scene. It might be just a clip, a view. It might even be just a mention. So it's trying to suggest events that haven't happened yet, but are coming. And we have three very specific examples of foreshadowing that I thought really made the point. One is the college lecture hall. In a scene in an episode coming up, we're going to discuss. The scene ends with a view of the lecture hall where Ted is teaching. That is a preview of the upcoming episode, and it is a preview of the season where Ted spends as a lecturer. But it's not enough of a scene to be a flash forward. It's just a hint that, hey, this is going to happen. We also have the roommate. And I didn't know whether to classify the roommate as a foreshadowing or a flash forward. I decided I would leave it as a foreshadowing because the roommate does not have enough screen time to really count as a real scene. But there is a point where Ted, constantly in search of the one, meets this interesting woman, goes out with her a couple of times, goes back to her apartment, and he's told the kids, and this is very clear, she is not their mother. She is their mother's roommate. And he goes to this woman's apartment and is inspecting all the things in her apartment and is talking about how this is such a perfect thing. She's into music. She's into this. She's into that. She's into the other. And every single one of them, the roommate says, well, that's not actually mine. That's my roommate's. All of these things that he was seeing that were, hey, this is the perfect woman for me. They were correctly the perfect woman. It just wasn't her. It was the mother. So we're setting up how perfect this woman is for him, but he doesn't meet her. We get to see one glimpse as she's sneaking through the apartment to take a shower. We see her ankle as the door closes behind her. And that's all we really get to see. So I would call this more foreshadowing, that they were telling us blatantly all the reasons why this is the perfect woman for him without ever meeting her, all in the context of this other woman who was not perfect. Not a bad person, but not perfect. And then the foreshadowing of the house. There is an episode where Ted has had yet another disastrous romantic encounter. Things are not looking good for poor Ted. He ought to give up and just become like Barney, just constantly skirt chasing. Don't stop romanticizing the one. And at one point, he does something utterly insane, and all of his friends try to tell him he needs to get out of this. He's decided that he doesn't have to do these things in order. Because remember, Mosaic story, the story doesn't happen in order. He doesn't have to do things in order. He doesn't have to find the perfect woman, get married, settle down, get a house, and so on. He just gets the house. And they think he's insane for doing this because he might never find the perfect woman. Ted Mosby is an architect. He loves designing and building houses, and he gets the house. And he is going to make the perfect house, so when the perfect woman comes along, he's ready for her. And they try to talk him out of it, and eventually he convinces them that this really is what he needs to do. And at the end of the episode, we see tiny glimpses of the house coming together, all of his work remodeling it and getting it ready. And it is ultimately the house where he's telling the story to the kids, because the story happens out of order. You can have ticking time bomb scenarios, especially in a Mosaic story, because the viewer, the audience, may be aware of things that the characters aren't. So the idea of the ticking time bomb is that there's some disaster coming, and the audience knows it, and the characters don't. In Hitchcock, he had the concept of the bomb. The reader knows there's this ticking time bomb, and the characters aren't. He talked about this as an example of tension. You've got the same scene shot twice. The first time you have a scene shot with a bunch of characters going to a restaurant, having a wonderful Sunday brunch, talking about all the things that are going on in their lives. It's revealing character. It might be revealing backstory, but it's really kind of nothing happening, just a lot of talking. And then you retell the same scene, but the first thing you show is a time bomb under one of the tables. And you tell exactly the same thing, but every one of these conversations now is fraught with tension because every one of these, the viewer, the reader is saying, but what if the bomb goes off now? What happens? What happens? Having ticking time bomb scenarios, which might come through either from flash forwards or even the unifying conceit itself, every time you have one of these ticking time bombs, the reader or viewer is now saying, how is this all going to happen? How is this going to blow up? And in How I Met Your Mother, some of these examples, they have the Autumn of Breakups is an episode, I think it was season 8, it might have been season 7, where amazingly enough, everybody seems to be in a successful romantic relationship. And then Ted the father in the future says, but this was the autumn of breakups. So you've got 3 different couples in wonderful relationships. And in that episode, one of them breaks up. So now the viewer's like, oh, wow, he wasn't kidding. And now they're paying attention and watching to see, well, there's 2 more relationships there. And he promised us they were all 3 going to break up. So now I want to know why these break up, because they were so perfect. And one of these was the Quinn arc. It's actually 2 arcs, but it's the second Quinn arc is one of these. The first Quinn arc was the story of Barney, actually one of a couple stories, because as Barney matured as a character, he became a little less chase anything in a skirt and became a little more open to, hey, some women are special. Some women might be right for me. And there was one he let get away because he wasn't quite ready to change and she wasn't really ready to wait for him. But then there was Quinn. Quinn was a stripper because Barney lived half his life, it seemed like, in strip bars. But he met Quinn and she was different and he couldn't get her out of his mind, partly because she kept rejecting him because she'd seen too many players and she just knew his game and was a step ahead of him all the time. So he kind of needed to win her over. And we'll talk about the episode where he kind of closed that up, but he kind of won her over. And it's like, okay, he got her to actually accept his proposal. And then at the end of that episode, I think it was the end of a season, we see the flash forward to the wedding. And now you've been primed. You've seen his amazing change in character, that he's going to be marrying Quinn. And we meet the bride, and it's Robin. Now we want to know, how did this happen? And we know we're going to lose Quinn. And so her entire second arc is the process by which we dump her. We are going to reach a point where they realize they are not right together. And therefore, they are going to break up, and we're going to end up with Robin. So this is the Quinn arc. And because of flash forwards, we know it's coming. We know that even though it was an amazing romantic courtship and proposal, it's not going to last. Barney's going to screw it up. Or Barney and Quinn together, I would say. But Barney screwing it up is the expected thing. So that second part of Quinn's arc is one giant ticking time bomb. That if you've been paying attention across the episodes, as opposed to picking up one now and then, you know that this is doomed. As beautiful and magical as it was, you know this is doomed. And then all of season 9 is essentially a ticking time bomb. Season 8, final episode, ends with a very brief scene, cut with other brief scenes, but a very brief scene where we as the audience meet the woman with the yellow umbrella. We meet the mother. So we know who she is. But in season 9, none of the others do. So she is the ticking time bomb. We know that anytime she shows up in an episode, it's very possible that this is the episode where another character meets her. And we start to see the connections there before Ted has ever met her. We start to see her integrating within. And it's how is she going to change all of their lives leading up to the final episode? So she is a giant ticking time bomb. She's also another literary technique, which I don't remember being on Wikipedia's page, but it's the MacGuffin. And the story makes a whole lot more sense if you realize that the mother was always the MacGuffin. This is a technique that Hitchcock named. It predated him, I'm sure. But the concept of a MacGuffin is the thing in the story that doesn't mean a damn thing, but it drives the rest of the story. It has no function within the story itself, but the other characters are all about it. And the classic example is the Maltese Falcon in the movie The Maltese Falcon. We hardly even ever see it. But the movie is about all of these other characters who want the Maltese Falcon and what they will do and who they will kill to get it. The Maltese Falcon itself could have been anything. It could have been a purple hat. It could have been a bank account. It almost didn't matter what it was. The important thing was that it was driving the action because other people wanted it. And How I Met Your Mother makes perfect sense if you realize that up until season 9, the mother is the MacGuffin. She is the excuse for Ted to tell the story. She is the goal he is pursuing, but not catching, but having all of these other adventures along the way. Up until that last season, she is the MacGuffin. She could never be in the story, and we still could have been complete. There are seasons where if the network had canceled them, they could have slapped on a final episode to reveal who she was, and the series would have been complete enough because she was not really the story. She was the MacGuffin. The setting itself, again, not just unique to Mosaic fiction, but the setting is the location where things happen. And a mosaic may be discontinuous in space. There's no reason not. And in this series, we have a number of recurring settings, each of which has symbolic meaning within the story. First, it's New York City itself, where most of the action happens. This is home. This is where we are and where we can't really escape. And eventually, in fact, everybody comes back to New York, even if they venture out. But then we have Farhampton. And Farhampton is where the wedding happens, where season 9 happens. Farhampton is symbolic for the path Ted has been on the whole series. He is headed towards Farhampton eventually. Wesleyan University, we talked about in terms of their flashbacks. Wesleyan is the symbol of Ted and Lily and Marshall forming the core trio of the group. We also have Minnesota, which is Marshall before he met Ted. This is the home he grew up in. It is a symbol for the distant pastoral rural life that made Marshall the optimistic, strange guy that he is. We have Westchester, which is where the home is, which is a symbol for Ted's future, where he will have or hopes to have the happily ever after. We have Canada, where Robin comes from, and I talked about everybody mocking it. Canada is a symbol for, hey, otherness, but it's an otherness that Robin doesn't give up. We have Cleveland, which was Ted's home. We don't see a lot of Cleveland, but we see episodes there where we see what Ted was before the series. And we have Rome. Rome is a symbol for Lily's pursuit of the art world and how they are going to eventually across the course of the series, they're eventually going to end up, after the wedding, end up going to Rome for Lily's career. And in fact, having their second child, their daughter, born there when they go to Rome. So each of these settings, A, has plot implications because story elements happen there, but B has symbolic implications. When you see Rome, it is about Marshall and Lily's future, even though eventually they will come back to New York. Multi-perspectivity, which is a word which just means multiple point of view characters. Obviously, in a framing narrative, we can have stories told from multiple points of view or about multiple points of view, even if the main narrator, Ted in this case, is telling it, it's points of view of the other characters. So your mosaic should often cross multiple points of view. And this story is very explicitly multiple perspectives. We have Ted, the architect, the hopeless romantic, the never say die guy, who is kind of a schmuck because life kicks him around, partly because he won't give up on his pursuits and life's not giving them to him yet. We have Marshall, the rural guy, come to the big city, the idealist, the environmental lawyer who can't manage to make a living in environmental law, the guy who wants to change the world. We have Lily, the woman who wants to make art. She has lots of other goals, but she wants to make art. And a lot of the series is how she got diverted from that life and how she made it anyway. We have Barney with his goals of, hey, I want to pursue women because it makes me feel happy after all the miserable things in my life. But if you told that to him, he would deny it. And we have Robin, who wants to have her career, but she has to give up a lot of things for it. And we see stories told through Ted, but stories told from the points of view of each of these characters. And breaking the fourth wall. Again, not necessarily just part of a framing story, a mosaic story, but it's a technique that certainly helps in this. It's the idea that sometimes the story acknowledges it's a story. Sometimes you are telling the audience, hey, remember, there's a story here. And done clumsily, it annoys people. Done well, it helps remind readers that, or audience, that they're here for a purpose. Doesn't have to be part of Mosaic, but it kind of almost is by implication, because I am telling stories within this story. So I am acknowledging that I am talking to you, or to the audience, but essentially to you, about other stories. And so it will draw attention, remind the reader that there is a fourth wall. And just as I said, that nonlinear stories annoy some readers are going to hate breaking the fourth wall. This particular series definitely has fourth wall breaking, because when Ted is talking to the kids, he is implicitly talking to the audience. But sometimes he even talks to the audience while talking to the kids. He polices his language because he's a father talking to his teenage sons. And so he polices his language, sometimes polices his contents of his story. So there is a scene of, I forget what the name of the episode was. Dawn Ray just joined in the process of bringing her back. I clicked, so let me go back here. There is an episode, and I don't remember exactly what it's called, something like the Murtaugh episode, where they are harking back to the Mel Gibson and Danny Glover movie, Lethal Weapon. And Murtaugh, the older cop in that, had a line, "I'm getting too old for this shit." And that was the sort of the theme of the episode of they're all getting older and there are things that they just can't do as easily as they used to do when they're young. And Barney trying to deny this because Barney is awesome and Barney doesn't get old. Barney is awesome. But every time Ted tells this story to the kids, it's, "I'm getting too old for this stuff." And there's a voiceover that wipes out the word shit and replaces it with stuff because he's policing the language. Also, because they're products of a particular age, They did a lot of drugs in college. And it's not really a secret, but Ted, the father, doesn't want to tell the kids about drugs. So they did a lot of sandwiches, and they did some big sandwiches back when they were in college. The audience knows that he is hiding the truth. So it is kind of almost breaking the fifth wall, that he is in the process of talking to the kids. He is nudging you in the ribs and saying, you know what's really going on here. So we have some other literary devices that I don't think are necessarily closely tied to Mosaic, but they're examples that I think the series does well, so I want to include those. Um, Chekhov's gun. There's different translations of this because it wasn't in English, but people argue over what it's supposed to say, and they're all arguing about the English translation. So I don't care if you say rifle, I don't care if you say gun, I don't care if you say pistol, because I doubt Chekhov said any of those. He was speaking in Russian. But colloquially, if you say in the first chapter there's a rifle hanging in the wall, second or third chapter, it absolutely must go off. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, tools, not rules. He was talking about drama, specifically plays, where you need to be economical. You need to not waste time because you only have so much time up on that stage. So don't put in unnecessary elements. But sometimes unnecessary elements are character building, they're world building. So it's not a rule, it's a tool, but it does convey some ideas that when you put things in, there might be implications down the road. And some specific examples of this are the slap bet. These characters, sometimes they have really kind of strange perspectives. One of their things is that you can pay off bets by a certain number of slaps. And early on, Barney and Marshall have a bet over something where Barney wins the bet and he gets to slap Marshall and he slaps. And then we find out that no, actually Barney lost the bet. So now he has to pay a penalty. And over time, the number of bets grows and grows and grows, that he's owed 5 bets. And these bets keep coming in at various episodes across the seasons, right up to the very end. That the slap bet is one giant Chekhov's gun humming early. That the idea that you get to slap your best friend is something that has dramatic significance and character significance and humor. So the slap bet is one Chekhov's gun. The yellow umbrella, besides being a unifying symbol, is again another Chekhov's gun. That when we first see it, it has no meaning, but it's going to grow. And cliffhanger, hardly need to explain this idea that, hey, there's something here that we're not finishing. We're going to come back to it later, and we want you to come back for it. Some examples of cliffhangers. That season 8 finale where we finally meet the mother after we've been waiting 8 years to find out how he met her. We meet her. And we are going, okay, now how's he going to meet her? And bang, there's the end of the episode, end of the season. Season 3 has a particular episode where Ted has all sorts of things going on in his life. He is trying to decide if he can get together with Stella, who is the doctor that he met. And there's things that are just troubling. It's not working out well, but he might. And then season 3, the Miracles episode, things start going wrong in his life, ultimately ending up with him in a car accident and in the hospital, and realizing that what his priorities are might not be what he thought they were. And he really decides that, hey, I need this woman in my life. And the next time they get together, he proposes to her, and close. End of this episode, end of the season. So there's a huge cliffhanger of, is she going to accept? Is she the mother? Now, if you paid really close attention in an early episode, we know that's not the mother. We know most of the women Ted meets are not the mother unless somebody's really lying to us. Because there was an episode where they were telling of another trip to a strip bar where Barney dragged Ted along for reasons I forget. but they were at the strip bar, and Ted is talking to this stripper there and how he didn't really want to be there. It's not his thing. He was there to support his friend, and she's talking to him, and he says, "What's your name?" And she says, "Amber." And she says, "Well, I'm Ted Mosby." And then she says, "Well, Amber's only my stage name. My real name is Tracy." And we cut to the kids open mouthed, and they're like, "That's mom?" He said, "No, I'm just jerking your chain." That was not the mom, the stripper. But we've just heard, if we paid close attention, that the kids heard, "My name is Tracy," and the kids said, "That's mom?" If you paid attention to that one episode, you know the mother's name is Tracy. Now, maybe Stella's middle name was Tracy or one of these other women, but we really, if we paid attention, we have a strong hint that any woman who he meets who isn't Tracy isn't the mother. But you have to have been paying attention to that one episode for that one 15 seconds. And if you weren't paying attention, you don't know that. But season 3 ends with a cliffhanger where it's like he asks her to marry him, and then we're going to have to wait. And in season 4, we have her accepting and then planning the wedding and then things going horribly wrong. But season 3 was a cliffhanger. And then we have the Magician's Code, which I've alluded to before. Barney, under his many, many, many oddities, Barney likes stage magic. Barney's actually good at stage magic. And in fact, Neil Patrick Harris, the actor who played Barney, is good at stage magic. None of the magic that Barney did in the series was camera tricks. It was all Neil Patrick Harris actually performing the tricks. The Magician's Code is about how, hey, you can't reveal your secrets other than to another magician. You just can't. It's against the code. Barney and Quinn, remember her, are flying out for a trip to Hawaii for some excuse, something going on in, I think it was Barney's life, not hers, but they're flying out to Hawaii, and Barney tries to get one of his tricks through the security, and security isn't letting him because it's suspicious boxes with strange noises. And they take him and Quinn off to a room and interrogate him. And he's like, "I can't tell. It's a magician's code." And finally, it's like, you're going to tell, or we're going to arrest you and take it all apart ourselves. So he performs this incredibly elaborate trick, which ends with a artificial flower rising up out of a box. And inside the flower is an engagement ring. And he gives it to Quinn and proposes. And we, as the audience, are like, that was the most elaborate and amazing proposal ever, even despite the fact that he had to do it in this non-ideal circumstance. That was amazing. And then we get the flash forward to the wedding, and we see that the bride is Robin. So that entire episode built us up and pushed us off the cliff. Because now it's like, wait a minute, that was perfect, and it fell apart. That's almost a cliffhanger without hanging. It's like you're left falling, wondering what's going wrong here. A eucatastrophe, much less commonly known literary technique, but it is on Wikipedia's page, a term originally put together by Tolkien, which is, hey, we see the protagonist is going to face a catastrophe. Things are going to get miserable, but something comes along and changes the fortune of the character and changes, therefore, the protagonist's view of the world. Now, that could sound like Deus Ex Machina, but a couple of the differences. One is there's a foundation for it. So when the Eagles come along and save the hobbits multiple times, we have seen earlier the relationship that the Eagles have formed with Gandalf. We have seen inside of the Eagle culture, which we don't get to see in the movies, but we see in the books. We understand that when they get involved, it's because they have recognized this and mostly don't care about the affairs of men and elves and dwarves and orcs and hobbits and whatever. When they get involved, it's serious. Honestly, the whole resolution of Lord of the Rings is, in some sense, a eucatastrophe. But again, there was a foundation for it. We saw Gollum going through all of his changes. We saw in the books, less in the movies, Frodo going through all of his changes. We saw the tension in both characters. When Frodo finally succumbs to the lure of the ring on the edge of the cracks of doom, and Gollum bites his finger off, takes it away, and falls into the lava. This has been a eucatastrophe for Frodo, that he was on the verge of disaster, but elements that were always there saved him at a horrible cost, but saved him. So the concept of a eucatastrophe is something that was always there, but in the background, coming forward to change things and avert disaster. And there are a couple of episodes of this. There is an episode called The Leap, which is about everything going wrong in Ted's life, his romantic life, but also his career life. He had tried, he'd left the architecture firm where he did all the work and got none of the credit. He had opened his own architectural firm. It had collapsed. It was a disaster. Everything was going wrong. He was trying to keep a stiff upper lip and be positive, and it just wasn't working. And the end of the episode ends up with Ted deciding to take a major, amazing chance, symbolically a leap. All sorts of things been going wrong in all of their lives. And there has been, and the only unfortunate thing here is they could have laid more foundation for this. It only really came up in this episode. The building next door is across an alley, but it is lower. So Marshall has long thought, hey, I bet I could jump across that. No, he hasn't. This is the first time we ever heard this. But the idea is that he has long thought about this. And he decides that the way he's going to symbolically shed the problems facing him is he leaps across, and he successfully does it. And the rest of them decide to follow, because they've all been through torment and turmoil. They all have this need to leap into a new life. So they all follow, ending with Ted talking to his kids about how this was the culmination of everything that had been going on and going wrong, and how he just had to believe it was going to get better. And he takes this leap of faith, and he successfully leaps across the gap and onto the roof next door. And the next thing we see is the foreshadowing, really, again, not a flash forward, of him in the college hall teaching architecture to a bunch of students. That was the leap he was not going to take. He'd already been offered the chance to teach this class, and he just didn't feel it was right for him. But he's taking that leap now. He's going to do that. He's going to do something different. And he will eventually learn, and he tells the kids this, he will eventually learn that the mother was in that classroom for reasons that she was in the wrong place, she thought. He was really in the wrong place, but she was in the classroom the first day he taught. Another time they came that close to meeting, but didn't. And it only happened because he took that leap and turned his disastrous fortunes in a positive direction. Another one is an episode called The Final Page. Now, Barney had long been known for his playbook, where he plans out these elaborate schemes for getting women to bed. And we are talking, for those of you old enough to remember, these are Rube Goldberg schemes. These are things that shouldn't possibly work, but because of story logic, he manages to get them to work. And he has got this amazing book that has got all of these schemes. It's a big, elaborate, leather-bound thing. And he eventually is talked into giving it up because he's trying to be a different person. But now we've lost Quinn. He's at a point where he has got to find a different path in his life. He has ended up in an odd relationship with Robin's nemesis, one of her co-workers, who absolutely annoys the hell out of Robin because she loves Robin so much and wants to do everything to make Robin happy. And Barney has ended up in a relationship with her at exactly the time where Robin has decided that Barney's the man for her. And she's like, I need to understand what I'm going to do with my life now. This can't work. This is just impossible. And she's like, I've lost Barney. I've lost Ted. I made all these choices. Nothing in my life is working out like I like. Ted, meanwhile, understands something that she doesn't. And they're going to a party to celebrate the completion of the building he designed. And she's going as his date, not romantic, just social. But instead, he forces her to go to the news building where she works because Barney is up on the roof getting ready to propose to the other woman. And if Robin is going to ever make her claim for Barney, this is her last chance, which she does not believe she's ever going to do. But he forces her essentially to say, look, this is more important than my party. If this matters to you, you've got to go do this. She goes up on the roof, and the roof is set up in this amazing, elaborate, romantic setting for dinner and everything. And there's a piece of paper on the ground. And she picks it up, and it is the last play in the playbook called The Robin. And it talks about this elaborate scheme he put together to convince her that he was serious and she should marry him. And she puts the paper down, and he's kneeling with a ring. She thought she was going there to see her life essentially be over in terms of her romantic possibilities. And instead, everything that was leading up to that was a scheme because Barney was a schemer, and he can't help but be a schemer. He doesn't know how to function without scheming. And he convinces her that he did this because she mattered that much to him. And so there's a eucatastrophe. She thought it was over, and instead it was just beginning. Now, I said I wasn't going to hold back from spoilers. The final episode is their marriage, and then in flash forwards, their divorce, because there was still too much. It wasn't that Barney was running around on her, it was that their relationship had run its course, and there were so many things that mattered in her career, but that he was kind of almost an appendage to her career, and neither one of them were happy anymore. But during this part, this final page, it was the perfect relationship at that point. So there were two eucatastrophes. In media res, which is, of course, beginning in the middle of a sequence of events, the whole thing is specifically in media res, that we start telling their said story towards the end, and we go back and go back and go back. The Lucky Penny I mentioned was an episode which starts with them running through the airport and then goes back and back and back to find how they went there. And then there is the pineapple incident, which is a story about Ted waking up in his bedroom, hungover, completely confused how he got there. There is a naked woman in bed next to him and a pineapple on the bed table. And the whole story is flashbacks of how they got to this spot and how he ended up in bed, who this woman was and everything. So it started in the middle with him waking up and then went backwards. We eventually found out who the woman was. She was not the mother, although it seemed like she might have been for a while there. She was a woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but that was what both of them needed at that time. But ultimately, she left. She did come back for a later episode, but she was not the right person. But the pineapple never got explained. But every once in a while, that pineapple would come back into the story. And it came back in season 9 that, oh, there's this pineapple. Remember the pineapple? And then there was a non-episode, just a web episode, which finally explained the pineapple. Other than that, I think every loose end in the series eventually got tied up. The pineapple didn't get tied up until off screen after the series. Short answer is in their drunken stupor, they stole the pineapple from someplace where it was sitting, and it ended up, they stole it from the future ex-husband of a woman Ted will meet and engage with in the future, who was a scary man who kind of wanted to be everyone's friend, but was so scary no one really knew how to take him. It was his pineapple, but he didn't even exist in the universe when it happened. But they wanted to tie up a loose end. Poetic justice is something happening that makes everything right, but with an ironic twist of fate. The biggest example of this is Barney's fate. Because Barney really, 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 even with Quinn and Robin, he really had trouble relating to and connecting to women. When you see him, he grew up in his mother's screwed up nature and how he grew up as kind of a gangly geek and how women betrayed him early on until he finally said, well, if that's what's going to happen, then I'm just not going to care anymore. Even though he and Robin end up divorced in the end, in the final episode, because Barney had recently, not recently, but in another season, had tried to pull off the ultimate seduction. He was going for his 200th woman, and there was a whole plot involving that. But this time, Barney's goal is he's going to do 30 women in 30 days just to show that he can do it, that he's that much of a player. And that he succeeded. And finally, after all of these years, he also finally hit the lottery that he never wanted to hit, because woman number 30 ended up pregnant. We never do find out her name, but she ends up pregnant, and Barney's like, get me out of here, get me away from here, get me out of here. I cannot be responsible for this new person and everything, until the day the number 30 gives birth. And Barney meets his daughter, and he's finally met the love of his life. And his whole life from there forward is about this perfect woman for him. Unreliable narrator is you cannot trust anything the narrator's saying. And that is, of course, the whole series. The whole series. Ted telling the stories to his kids isn't telling the truth. He's telling a romanticized memory of the truth. So the whole thing is unreliable narrator. There are things that happen that just, no, that couldn't really happen. But yes, it did. I promise you, this is exactly how it happened. One particular blatant example of this was the goat. I think there's in season 2 where they're at a party and Ted is talking about all the strange, bizarre things that happened at this party and all of these things that just you wouldn't believe it. And you don't, because he's an unreliable narrator. But and then there was the goat, but he doesn't tell the goat. And then there was the goat, but he doesn't tell the goat. And gets all the way to the end of the episode and is like, oh, wait, the goat wasn't this party. That was a whole different party a year later. He's been telling us about this goat story all along, and it was wrong. It wasn't there. And then I mentioned the episode Miracles, where everything went wrong for him, and the goat comes up in that episode. Audience surrogate is pretty obvious. This is a character who reflects the fact that the audience has questions. And by explaining to that character, you are explaining to the audience. That is the kids. But you can also have author surrogates, which are based on the authors. So you can kind of insert their point of view in this. And Carter and Bays, the creators of the show, literally are Ted and Marshall. No, none of these things literally happened to them, but it is the story of their lives together and their friend groups and the encounters and so on, that essentially it is letting them put themselves in their own story. First person narration, obviously the whole thing is told from Ted's point of view. Magical realism, and this is one that I don't hear a lot of people talk to as part of this show. I see some, but it was honestly, it was a great example of magical realism. The idea of magical realism, it's often told from the point of view of other cultures, but there's no reason it can't be happening in New York. It's a real world setting that impossible, magical, miraculous things happen that might tie into particular beliefs, and nobody questions them. That's just the way the world is. And we got a bunch of examples of magical realism in this show. In an early season, Marshall and Lily are trying to deal with the fact that they don't live in the best, most expensive place. And at one point, they're looking around and they find a creature that they can't agree if it's a cockroach or a mouse. And eventually they realize it's a cockamouse. Half cockroach, half mouse. Of course, that can't happen, but they're convinced it is. And for the purposes of the story, not only is it a cockamouse, but it flies. So you've got this mouse-sized furry cockroach flying through the world and eventually escapes. The cockamouse, for the purposes of this story, is an absolutely real thing. There's an episode in one of the many times where Ted would like to get back together with Robin. And Robin has, after going back and forth on the idea, Robin is finally accepting an invitation to go camping from one of her coworkers that she doesn't really like the guy, but she's like, there might be something there. And he's invited her to go camping. And Ted is convinced that if that does not happen, he and Robin will get together. And he needs the camping trip to be rained out. And he's going through elaborate schemes to rain out the camping trip. He has Barney contact one of his former dates, which Barney doesn't like to do, but for the sake of Ted, he does. One of his former dates who had an anthropological study of Indian tribes. So he wants her to do a rain dance for him. She's like, look, I'm not in the tribe. And this is just a cultural tradition. It doesn't really work. But she gives it a try. She kind of like, okay, I'll try, but it doesn't work. She leaves. She's got places to be. And Ted and Barney are on that roof. And Barney's asking why this matters to him so much. And he's talking about how this could be it. This could be what gets us back together. This is what it needs to be. And if that's what it needs to be, then this has to happen. And I'm going to make it happen. And he starts dancing on that roof. And it is sad. And it is pathetic. It is, Barney is just like, man, you're losing it. And it starts to rain. Because in the magical realism of How I Met Your Mother, rain dances can work if you care enough. Jinxes are another prominent element. That jinxes aren't just a folk belief. In the logic of this universe, jinxes matter. If you break a jinx, bad things do happen to you. There is also the concept of doppelgangers. They have this theory that there's a duplicate of everyone, and that there is somewhere in New York, there is a duplicate of every one of them. And sure enough, we see the doppelgangers show up in different episodes, and to the point where they start to plan their lives around him. When Lily and Marshall are trying to decide whether or not it's time to have a baby, they come up with the absurd decision that it can't be time until we've seen the fifth doppelganger. And they have not yet seen a doppelganger of Barney. And an entire story revolves around seeing that doppelganger of Barney. And until then, it's not the right time. And they see the doppelganger of Barney. And it's time. This taxi driver that's a doppelganger of Barney. It's time. We're going to have a kid, until Marshall eventually gets picked up by the same cab driver, and it's Barney running a scam. So now he has to tell Lily that no, it's not time, because the doppelganger rule cannot be broken. Eventually, they see another doppelganger, and that's when the rule becomes a meta rule, because Lily now knows it's time. And you as the audience can see that that guy looks nothing like Barney at all. Nothing like Barney at all. But in Lily's eyes, he does, because it is time. We will have a much later episode when they are pregnant and they're getting ready for the baby coming, where they do meet Barney's doppelganger. one of their prenatal doctors looks so much like Barney that Marshall is convinced it's another scam until they see the doctor and Barney in the same room all together. And Marshall is still like, how did you pull that off? Doppelgangers are a real thing there. And then Ted's faith itself, his belief that no matter what, there is a destiny for me. The right woman is out there. That is a magical realism. It is absolutely a law of this universe that eventually it's going to happen. All right. So, questions on this? Let's go back and look at what I missed in the chat. Bex recommending making story models. Thank you, Bex. Cloud Atlas. I have read that Cloud Atlas is a good definition of a frame story. I have not gotten around to reading that one yet. I'm not familiar with Cabin Fever. Ted is a geek, heard the kettle. The pot heard it too. And yes, the goat episode was wonderful.
Hey,
Other
Mark,
question? Yeah.
you forgot one literary context that they use a lot in How I Met Your Mother. The
Okay.
running gag.
Oh yes, the running gag. The running gag. The
The
slap
whole
bet
show
woman
is running
gag.
gags.
Yeah. Legendary. The slap bet. Just
Barney in general.
yeah. And those are kind of fall under the larger heading of unifying symbols
Yeah.
because they help tie the different episodes together. So, but that's how bad am I doing? Oh yeah, I've gone nearly an hour over. But okay, I have certainly hopefully presented some great information. I've spoilered the hell out of it, but I'm sorry, I did promise that ahead of time. This is our upcoming schedule. I suddenly realized, it took me long enough, that August 10th cannot be a jazz session because we are doing our annual Ann Arbor Duelist Fencing Tournament. And this year, we're doing 2 days. Pray for us. It could be a debacle. But we have never finished a tournament day earlier than 10 o'clock at night. Now, spread over 2 days, maybe we can finish earlier, but I just cannot count on being out in time for a jazz session on the 10th. So I pushed everything back a week. So we have Dwarves in the Woods next week, then our tribute to Dean, then skip a week, then Distance and Scope in Space, Learning from Improv, the Bradbury Method, which I recently presented for the Apex Writers Group. So some of you may have already seen it there. Talk about the how, when, why of learning, and then 4 weeks in a row talking story models. Other questions? Hello. All right, again, paying for the soup. I actually got the wrong final slide here because this is from the Fine and Dangerous season. It's supposed to be Uncle Roy's, but hey, the Fine and Dangerous season is a great book as well that is available through the Writers of the Future bundle now through August 11th. Any final questions? All right, then I thank you for your time and attention. I went a little over on my time here, of course, but I will stop the sharing and I will bid you all have a good day and close the recording. Thank you.